You know, you don't have to worry about making us happy here or anything. This kind of stuff I enjoy, so that comes by itself. Okay, we didn't get quite finished with chapter 6, which I sort of expected yesterday. And these, the end of chapter 6, these are some issues that not all of you will experience. But they are a little bit unique and can sometimes leave us sort of floundering a little bit. And so for that reason, I included them. As a matter of fact, the one we'll talk about now, about bedwetting at night and stuff, that wasn't in his first book. It is now in the second book. And we did have one of our children have problems with that. And we tried to use our normal parenting strategies, and that didn't work. So eventually, we finally realized that didn't work, that we had to just sit back and wait. So the problem of bedwetting at night, and the child is already potty trained during the day, but at night, not every night, but quite regularly there are accidents. And some children, it may simply be that they're very deep sleepers. And there are things like small bladder, or what could even be a urinary tract infection, although that usually isn't a prolonged thing, that usually gets caught and taken care of. But yeah, sometimes a visit to a urologist can be helpful. That's one thing that we didn't do, we didn't think of or anything. The problem can also be an emotional or psychological one. If there are changes that the child perceives as fairly significant, fairly big changes. Let's say one of the parents all of a sudden has to go to the hospital for a week or whatever, or one of the parents goes on an extended work trip. You know, something that the child finds quite abrupt and quite major can trigger things like that. Or if there is tension between mom and dad, that kind of stuff, or depending on the age of child, of course, but maybe it's experiencing some bullying by other children, that kind of thing. And also first-time experiences can be triggers. Camp directors that run a camp of children that are coming for the first time, they will find that they need mattress protectors because a significant number of children will suffer from that. So, and often the child really has no clue why it's happening, and if they're not too young, then they're probably distressed about it themselves. So as parents, one needs to be very patient, try to be observant and sort of think, where can this come from, and see whether there are circumstances that one can adjust to help. But one thing I found out, punishing a child is not, that doesn't accomplish anything. So it's a matter of being patient. Like I said, mattress protectors already. One thing that Dobson says, and I tend to agree with him, he says, don't try to prevent it by waking the child once more during the night and taking him to the bathroom. And he gives the reasoning for it. He says, when you do that, you take the child to the bathroom, and the child is actually still half asleep. And but it'll go then, and it'll start building a pattern where if then the child maybe is dreaming or something, because our sleep isn't steady. We sleep deeply, and then we sleep lightly for a while, and then deeply, like throughout the night. that changes up and down. When we sleep lightly, it's called rapid eye movement, REM sleep. And so in the REM sleep cycle, if then there's any little disturbance, then the brain thinks, okay, my parents are taking me to the toilet right now, and will wet the bed there. So he discourages taking them to the toilet during the night. Let the thing move and grow out of it, sort of. Okay. Oh, and the other thing is, this, of course, is an embarrassment to the child, and especially once the child gets to be 5, 6 years old. Of course, that's embarrassing to them. I don't know. When our kids were small, there was such a thing as sleepovers. Is that still done, or is that?
Yes.
Pardon me?
Sadly, yes.
Oh, and so that really becomes very awkward then for a child like that. So of course that is something that one has to be sensitive to. Certainly, never shame the child, thinking that's going to make the child reform or master the problem, and absolutely forbid siblings to tease the child or to tell others about it outside the family and so on, and be prepared to deal with a sibling if the sibling doesn't hold that order. Another visit to a urologist might help, but if physically everything is in order, then one has to wait till things correct themselves. What I would strongly recommend, at that time there was this, as parents you're looking for solutions. And we found the one marketing thing, you could rent a buzzer. And that buzzer had clips that you would clip to the brief of the child, to the panties, and then if the child wets the panties, then that will complete the connection, and then the buzzer will go. But that's too late. You're not preventing anything. All you're doing is arousing the child once the accident has happened. So as far as I'm concerned, stay a mile away from that. There's no point to that whatsoever. Basically, it takes patience and sensitivity. Sometimes a child, punishing doesn't do much. Whether it's spanking or some other form of punishment, they're just sort of, they're hardened to it and that kind of thing. That can come from being inconsistent, and the child is at the point where, nothing quite makes sense anyhow, so he just hardens himself. Or it may actually be a match of the will. Am I going to listen to my parents' will, or are they going to listen to mine? And so it can actually be a war between parent and child. Sometimes, and this I don't say from experience, but he mentions that he's had families that have come to him who there were certain things that they never made a big deal of, and then realized with time that this needs to be corrected, this needs to be taken care of, And so when they started doing that, then the child, if it's a child with a fairly strong will, would become insulated against punishment. Or if the spanking is too gentle, some of us have very soft hearts, and so we drar nicht ganz noch no manchmal, and then that can be another reason that the child starts to become scornful about any punishment, whether spanking or other. And remember what I said yesterday, spanking is a last resort. That's not the go-to thing. And the reason I spent quite a bit of time on it yesterday was because it can go wrong quite easily. And so I wanted to give you a fairly fine, detailed coverage of that. Now, there are some children that he suggests should not be spanked, for example, mentally handicapped children. Now, here I imagine that the parents know best because there are degrees of being handicapped. Hyperactive children. That one, I don't know whether that would be true across the board or, so I haven't made up my mind on that one. But a child that has been abused, and that I can see. A child that has been abused, beaten, and things like that, there one would have to be extremely careful. Or then a very sensitive child, well, of course, there it's probably not even necessary. Another thing, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but have you ever punished your child for something and they wouldn't quit crying and they would start getting this, you could hear this anger in their cry? So certainly when a child gets punished crying, that's to be expected. But if the crying goes on and on and on, then you realize there's some manipulation going on. Or if it sort of gets that edge, that hard edge, then there's anger there, and that somehow has to be dealt with. Now, we haven't had problems because, I think it's because of the practice after a punishment, and needn't only be spanking punishments, but punishments generally, to consciously, purposely show the child that you love it, hug it and talk to it and so on and so forth. And so I think that can avoid some of these kinds of problems. Here's one. This one I've used. Not just a few times. Siblings scrap, right? They sankas it. And then sometimes it's time to step in. And so one, probably a favorite method of mine would be, I would set down 2 chairs, someplace where either Gabi was working or I was working, we were around, set down 2 chairs, you sit here, and those 2 chairs were probably only that far apart, so that they could kick each other if they really wanted to, but facing each other, and okay, you'll sit here now till both of you apologize to each other so that we can hear it. And then they determine how long they're going to sit there. So, pardon me? And because, there's also such thing, she apologized, but she didn't mean it. Okay, see, then they're still sitting there. It's until they mutually agree that they'll change their ways. So,
What do you do if only one child wants to apologize?
Then they have to sit there. Yeah. Community effort. Pardon me? Well, if they make a game out of it, then I guess really in a sense they have reconciled between the two of them. And so I think I'd probably then let him go. But okay, and here's another one, and this we have experienced. When your child gets bullied, like at school or someplace where you're not around, and you find out about it, at least I taught my kids that you don't go picking fights and things like that. Then he comes home, is banged up or stuff like that, and you realize that he's being bullied by somebody. And at first I tried to give some advice to, be careful how you talk to them, or when you don't, be a bit careful about not being alone someplace with them and those kinds of things. But there came the day where I, as a Mennonite, gave my son permission to defend himself. No, that's I don't know that he actually ever did, but all this made me go to the school. He didn't want me to. He thought things would just get worse, but I finally said, no, now I need to find out some stuff. So I went and talked to the teacher, and here's what I found out. The main guy it was always about 3 guys ganging up on our son. And the ringleader of that, he was living with his mother, who had shacked up for a while with a man who had brought some children into that situation. And then that man had wandered off again, left his children with his mother and him, and I think he maybe had a sibling or 2 yet. I'm not quite sure anymore. And this, of course, all happened in Germany, in the former East Germany, and all happened in a big apartment block. And this man moved in with a different woman in that same apartment block. I mean, it was just a mess. And so this boy did practically no work in school and classes and stuff like that. But he was athletic. And so that's where he could shine. And in gym class and things like that, that's where he was able to get some self-satisfaction. And then this foreigner comes, and this guy can jump as high as he can, and he can run as fast as, and he didn't inherit that from me. Run as fast as he can and things like that. Now he wasn't a star anymore, athletically. And I assume that is largely what triggered the whole thing. Like I say, somehow Tim seems to have managed to avoid it getting too serious. He's never admitted that he defended himself with his fists, but I did give him permission for that. So here, jealousy can be a thing, or dysfunctional family, like I just related in that example, or trying to prove himself in a group, those kinds of things. These reasons do not excuse what the boy did, but it helped me as a dad to at least have a little bit of a picture of what was really going on. And also now there was communication between our son and me, and I could sort of monitor it a little bit. Any questions? We're at the end of chapter 6 here. Okay. Okay, 7 and 8. Who knows whom I'm talking about when I talk about Eli and Samuel? Oh yeah, most of you. So Eli, of course, was the priest. When Samuel became a little baby, his mother was childless and all that. And then when once Samuel was weaned, she brought him to the tabernacle, and Samuel was essentially raised by Eli. And I'm just going to tell this to keep things moving a little bit faster. You can find all this in 1 Samuel 2 and then a couple of chapters after that, and that's all in your notes there. Eli's sons were, of course, worthless. They're called the sons of Belial, excuse me, which means evil, ungodly, wicked. You know, these are the preacher's kids. And so they did not have respect for the way the priestly practices were done. As a matter of fact, at the bottom there, it's a direct quote. They despised the offerings of the Lord. In other words, they scorned them. It wasn't meaningful to them in any way, shape, or form. And you see, the priests were entitled to, from some of the sacrifices, they were entitled to part of the sacrifice that God had set that up so that there was a system of how the priests could have food on the table. A grain offering, for example, they would get a portion of it. You can find that in those Leviticus passages. The guilt and sin offering, they would get a little bit of meat, no fat, nothing from the insides or liver or kidneys. Those are also organs that are edible. They were not allowed any of that. The meat from the sin offering was boiled, and that is where these guys drew the line. They liked barbecue as much as Belizeans do, and they did not want boiled meat for that. They wanted the meat raw so that they could put it on the fire, on the grill or whatever, and have a nicely fried piece of meat. From the peace offerings, those were voluntary offerings. If you were thankful, then you would bring an animal to the tabernacle and offer it there, and most of it would actually get consumed. There were certain pieces that got put on the altar, but the actual meat, most of it would be consumed. And the breast and the right thigh, that the priest got. So these were some of the rules that God had set up for all that. And so with the sin offering, what the priest did, I'm assuming that Eli did this, he had a fork that he would put into the boiling water, and whatever he brought up, that was his for the day. And like I already said, his sons wanted raw meat, not boiled meat. And then the other thing they did is they practiced immorality with the women who served in the temple. And Eli chided his sons, and fine, I guess by that time they were adults, grown up, couldn't do very much else maybe. I suppose he could have maybe cut them off as priests, but that was sort of a hereditary thing, and So basically, it tells us that something had gone missing during the time when those boys were growing up. And Eli wasn't putting a stop to these things, but God did. In chapter 2, verse 34, we read that God said that he was going to put an end to it. And so this here I'm just pointing out the attitude that Eli's sons had, this lack of respect for God's instructions about sacrifices, about adultery. I mean, that comes straight out of the Ten Commandments. And they just refused to live by those things. So, and that's how they did it with the meat. And now, that I already suggested, possibly from lax parenting or then also inadequate teaching and training. And I'll point out once more that teaching is a very important part of discipline, that we've reminded ourselves that the child has to know beforehand that there's something that you disapprove of. We don't punish a child because he innocently did something. So teaching is always an important part of disciplining. Now, teaching by example is great. As a matter of fact, it's important. If I tell my children to do something, but in my behavior do the opposite, then of course that gets them totally either confused or scornful, disrespectful. But I am a big believer in also teaching why, giving a reason why there's a certain rule. And I believe that most children, it helps them to understand what is going on. Teaching must also be intentional. There are values that we want to instill in our children. There are skills, basic life skills. As far as values is concerned, I find a good place to turn to is Galatians 5:22 and 23. It's the fruit of the Spirit, and I used to know them off by heart, but I won't embarrass myself now because I don't know them off by heart anymore. But, Galatians 5, no, not 22 and 23. Pardon me? No, that's wives be subject to your, that's not what I'm after. Oh, I'm in Ephesians. Yep. Yeah, this looks better. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. Those are values that we want to teach our children. And not just teach them off by heart, but teach them to live them. And then life skills, of course, there are things like cleanliness or being organized or those kinds of things. Providing for oneself, time and money management. Money management includes, working for money and also learning how to save. I think I already told you about our daughter having opportunities to buy books in school, and so that kind of stuff. One can start that relatively early. Another thing that we did, which Gabi heard over the radio, and we tried it, and it actually worked quite well. We started giving our children a little bit of a larger allowance. I don't remember exactly how much it was, and that maybe isn't that important, but a little bit of a larger allowance. And we still looked after their basic physical needs, but let's say they wanted a particular pair of shoes that was more expensive than what we would normally have bought them, then they had the opportunity to buy that themselves, and those kinds of things. And from that, they also had to put some aside to give to Sunday school or to church, and various things like that. They had to put some into savings. This was mandated. I mean, at that age, they didn't have a choice about that, and they needed to keep record so that we could teach them how to budget and how to do things like that. And it worked quite well. We're talking, what, around 12 years old? 13. And then when it got to our third child, we started with him too. And didn't work. His money was always all gone. and so we cut off the pilot project. And then I think it took, several months, 2-3 months, or maybe 2 months. And he comes back to Gabi and he says, let's try that again. I think I'm ready to try that once more. And it worked. So, that was a relatively painless way, and yet he had learned a lesson there. So, yeah, that's money management. Risk-taking, we talked about that the other day already a little bit. And kids, rural kids on farms and stuff, they are natural risk takers because they have the opportunity. But a lot of children who live in high apartment blocks and have hardly any chance to climb trees and do things like that are somewhat handicapped when it comes to risk assessment for themselves. Now, teaching a child to understand the why. If a child knows why, it's more likely to follow the instruction. But we have to be honest when we tell them why and so on and so forth. If we fool them, then we lose credibility. Then they quit believing us. I had an experience in Russia. Now, this was no longer a child. This was a young woman. But she was in my class there in the Bible school. And she just had a sad face. That's the only way I can say it. I never saw her smile. And so I asked her one day whether she wanted to talk about it or whatever. Then she said, yes, but not here. This was in a dining room across the table. And so then later in the day, we met together with the translator. We met, and she told me how she had lost her brother. He had committed suicide, and she had been very close to him. There's more to that story, but it gets too long. Anyhow, so she missed her brother, and her brother was not a believer. And so I guess she had talked to one of the ladies at church, and that lady had assured her, oh yeah, in eternity, you'll get to see him again. Her brother was not a believer. She told me that herself. And yet, this lady in church had told her, oh yeah, you'll get to see him again. Don't worry about it. And, I was a little bit afraid, but I turned to a few Bible verses. I says, no, that's not going to happen. And the symptom for her was that she didn't sleep nights. She was exhausted. And so then after I told her this, then the next night she had slept. And I didn't see her the following year, but I saw her 2 years later. Accidentally bumped into her in a church service. What do you think was the first question I asked her? Are you sleeping? Yes. The truth may hurt, but it's powerful. We have to be careful how we say it, of course. But to fib has bad results. So with our children, when we're teaching them, we need to be honest. We need to tell them the truth. And then if we do that, the child knows that we're not just putting down rules so that we can be boss, that we can be the parent and order them around. But there's actually logic. And this isn't so much a thing when they're really young, but certainly once they're pre-teens and early teens and stuff like that, they want to know that there's method to our madness, that there's a reason why we ask them to behave in certain ways, do certain things, and so on and so forth. Another thing is clear boundaries. Boundaries sometimes are viewed as prisons. As a matter of fact, there was a situation in the States where a school, and our schools in our province, not the high schools, but the elementary schools and the middle schools, they all have a 6-foot chain link fence around them. And one educator decided that that was a prison. We were imprisoning students. And so at his request, they actually took that fence down. And as long as the fence was up, the children used the whole playground. Once the fence came down and the playground was open to the street and to cars driving by and stuff like that, the children stayed in the middle of the playground. They didn't go near the edge. They didn't have nearly as much territory to play in as they had with the fence up. Children like boundaries. So Eli's sons got punished. The judgment was pronounced. The messenger was Samuel. The scope was Eli and his household. He got told, your household is going to get wiped out. And no sacrifice or offering. This is actually in the Bible. No sacrifice or offering is sufficient anymore to recover from this situation. God had had it with them. So Hophni and Phinehas died, and Eli died when he heard that the Ark of the Covenant had been captured. Just very quickly, the Ark of the Covenant, of course, was a very holy thing, a very holy, I don't know, call it a piece of furniture maybe or whatever, because it represented God's presence with the Israelites. It was not something that your ordinary Israelite got to see or view or anything like that. It was in the Holy of Holies where the high priest went into the Holy of Holies once a year with a bowl of blood. Those were all stipulations. Now, of course, when they moved, then there were rules in how it got covered and how it got carried and so on. But this was not just, anything that no plaything. It had to be treated with respect. And so somebody got the bright idea that, hey, we're losing against the Philistines, but maybe if we take God with us to battle, then we'll win. God's going to see to it he won't let something happen to the Ark of the Covenant. And so it had led them through the wilderness, it had led them through the Jordan, and it had led them around Jericho, but they found out very quickly that it did not it did not save them in this war. And so Samuel replaces Eli the priest. Samuel becomes the judge. See, Eli was a priest then, but there had been judges up to that point, and priests, those were two things. And Samuel sort of became wrapped in one there. And as well, he was considered a prophet. Find that in 1 Samuel there. Now, of course, that was 20 years after Eli died, Samuel first had to grow up. And so Samuel was the last of the judges. He was recognized as a prophet, and he performed sacrifices. He isn't actually ever called priest, but we know that he performed sacrifices, for example, when before they were going to go to war, where Saul actually jumped the gun. And he also performed sacrifices in Bethlehem when David got pre-anointed, and so on. So that was Samuel. Samuel dealt with Saul when he disobeyed orders. And he actually tried to convince Israel they shouldn't clamor for a king. But God finally told Samuel that go ahead, let them have their king. But this is what I want to get at. Samuel had sons. Now Samuel had seen what happened with Eli and Eli's sons. And when Samuel gets old, the people say, we don't want your sons to lead us, because his sons weren't following Samuel's ways. So something got unhooked there also. He must have made some of the same mistakes that Eli made. Now, Samuel's ministry was different than Eli's. Samuel traveled, whereas Eli served at the tabernacle. And we know a father who travels, it's more difficult to build a good relationship with the children. So it may well be that not having spent the amount of time, that fathering relationship did not get the attention that it should have. And fathers in ministry have to be careful. God's work is important. Often we see it even as imperative. And so it is, as a preacher, as a minister, one can reason one's way through this and say, yeah, but I need to help this person, I need to help that person, and that needs doing, and so on and so forth. But the child still feels that neglect. And I remember my dad was a lay pastor in our church. He would go to the Sunday school meetings when they were meeting and organizing. He would go here and he would go there. And I remember as probably a 20-something, 21, 22 maybe in there, saying to him, you don't have to go to every meeting. Children, even small children, but certainly teenagers, they sense when the father, the parents are not giving them the attention that they really deserve. We said in the second evening that children's need is love, and that it's the responsibility of the parents to see that they get that. The parents are, their due is respect, and it's their responsibility to teach the children to have respect for parents. So children catch on very quickly when parents are too busy. This can also happen with parents at work, business people, farmers, wage earners. We want to get ahead. If that starts to take a priority that is too strong, then we are in danger of neglecting the relationship that we should be nurturing with our children. And this can also happen with mothers. And this is probably especially critical during preschool years. Often that is the mothers, when the mothers have a particularly important role to play. And but not only, one reads from time to time how children don't actually like to come home to an empty house. They call them latchkey children, where they come home from school and they have to unlock the door and let themselves into the house because both parents are working. And in our country, that is almost every household. There are very seldom that there's a household where one of the parents is home when the children come home. Oh yeah. And fathers, we're not dictators. That's something that we can easily be guilty of, at least if you have the kind of temperament that I have. It's something that one has to work on. We fathers have to discipline ourselves, and we have Bible references to push that. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. Now it's Ephesians, okay. There we read, "And fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord." That provoke to anger, parorizo, that the idea is to anger somebody or to inflame somebody. Sometimes that can happen without maybe even really wanting to, but certainly we should not do that intentionally. What are some ways that we can anger our children, make them mad? I've put up there teasing. Are there other ways? Have you seen other ways or have you experienced other ways that a father can anger his child? Okay, yeah. Maybe expecting things from him that he can't deliver, he's not capable of doing, those kinds of things. Making fun of, or maybe in the child's presence, telling a friend of his, sort of mocking his child or making fun of him, those kinds of things. So Paul very clearly, do not provoke your child to anger, but to train them up in the Lord. And that same Paul has a very similar message. He uses a different word in Colossians, which means exasperate. This sort of has the idea of, making something impossible. The child is trying his hardest to do it already, and there's just no way, and it's still being expected from him. As a matter of fact, that Greek word, pikraino, they've found a recipe from Jesus' time, and that word meant bitter. So fathers, don't make your sons bitter and embitter them or cause resentment. And again, sometimes one can maybe do it by accident, but certainly it should never be done intentionally. And what are ways to embitter a child? Let's say he did not do something, and yet we insist that he must have done it. That would embitter a child. Or again, unreasonable expectations, those kinds of things. We have to, as fathers, learn that our children have feelings too. And another thing that we cannot teach them through either shaming or getting them angry or that kind of thing. Just very quickly, reviewing some of the responsibilities that we have as parents. And in Timothy 5:8, we read that it is our duty as parents to provide for family. In 2 Corinthians, parents, there Paul says, parents, you need to provide for your children, not your children for you. An exception, once the parents are 86 and old, the children will provide for parents. That's not the idea here, but as parents, we have brought the child into the world, and it is our responsibility to provide for them. Teach your children about God. Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 and 7. And we had that in either the first day. That's our responsibility. Teach God's word to them. And that word should also be visible in our house. Now, I know there are country and western songs about dust on the Bible and stuff like that. That's not necessarily what we're talking about, but God's word should be visible in that we as parents use it. And I sometimes hear someone saying that, my dad would sit down in the evenings and read out of the Bible. That kind of thing we're talking about. As parents, we are a link. We all know the principle that a chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And we are a link. We are a link from our parents to our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And if our parents were believers and taught us about God, and we don't pass that on, the chain's broken. So we are a link, according to Psalm 78, 5-8. Passing on God's commands to future generations and helping our children, our grandchildren, to avoid going into a godless future. So that also is our responsibility as parents. And that our descendants have an opportunity to put their confidence into God. That they remember God's works. So, of course, we try to make them familiar with the narrative of God's Word, which describes God's actions, activities from front to back, and to keep His commandments. And we want to teach them to behave righteously. Now, righteousness is sort of a combination of being good, being kind, being generous, things that basically all people would see as positive things. And being fair in one's dealings, treating others as equals, not looking down at others, those kinds of things. So according to Genesis 18 and chapter 18, verse 19, we are supposed to teach our children righteousness and also justice. Same verse. Behaving in a way that is upright, being truthful and open in our dealings, treating others correctly in the eyes of the law. This all belongs to justice. And Isaiah says we're supposed to teach our children that God is faithful, that one can depend on God. We might ourselves have experiences that we can relate to our children to reinforce this. So, a very quick example, and a very small example. But we arrived in Toronto, and we had to stay night in Toronto in order to come here. And we already had booked a room in a hotel right near the airport. And that hotel has a shuttle, so they'll come and pick you up at the airport and take you to the hotel, and in the morning they'll take you back. And there was confusion about where exactly we should meet that shuttle. And then I was able to phone the hotel, and they gave us some directions. Now, an airport employee had told us that the shuttles all come at ground level. We should first see that we got down to ground level. So that's where we went. And there was no post 13. We had been told to go to post 13. So here we were down at ground level, and there actually were shuttles driving by. And we weren't sure where to go. And Gabi sees a lady there, and just asked her. I was looking at posts and numbers and stuff like that. And she asked this lady, and this lady was going to the same hotel, had already found out that it was post R3, not post 13, and we were right there. All we had to do was wait another few minutes until the thing drove up. Would you call that God being faithful? I am calling it that. God helps us sometimes when we haven't even asked yet. Teaching our children to fear the Lord, passing on our experiences. And that means that we have to be aware in our life. Be aware when things happen. Hey, this isn't chance. A bigger hand was involved here. Now, the nature of parenting, tell the child about God's activities. That's what Joshua instructs us to do. How God intervened in my life. How God has shown himself. For example, I can tell my kids about how he has intervened in my parents' life. How God has directed church congregation or the conference. Tell your child about Mennonite history. Where does our faith come from? Why is there something like a Mennonite? What does it even mean? Those kinds of things. Give them some background. So we want children to know that God has an interest in them. So, and this comes in Jeremiah, says this specifically in chapter 29, verse 11. Now, the context there, of course, is to the Jews. So does it even apply to us? Well, the thing is, there are promises in here that are for the Jews, that are not first and foremost for us nowadays. But usually there is a principle in there that we can still apply in our lives nowadays. And even though Jeremiah was talking to a people that had been exiled to Babylon, they were being punished there, he's telling them God is interested in them, even though he is punishing them just then. And so this one has two parts. God has plans for us, and that gives us hope. He said that to the Jews when they were in Babylon in punishment. So mostly I've been using parental failures in these lessons, but there are a few that are positive, like the noble woman in Proverbs chapter 31, Jonadab and his descendants in Jeremiah 35. That was the ancestor some generations earlier who had told his sons and his grandsons, leave off drinking wine, that just makes trouble for you. And when Jeremiah tried to tempt them, he was doing this as an object lesson. He didn't actually want these guys to fall for it, but he did this to try to teach somebody else something. Put some wine before them, and they said, no, our ancestor said, don't do it, and we're not going to do it. They hung on to that lesson. Mary and Joseph, we mentioned that yesterday. And Timothy's mom and his grandma are, Paul describes them as parents who did their job and had taught Timothy well. 15 minutes. And then it's the last chapter, and we'll roar through that one. Okay, let me tell you a little experience that I had years ago. I was working at the lumber yard, and it was coffee break, and we were talking about families and so on and so forth. And something came up about our children starting to date and so on. And then my junior boss said, boy, am I glad I have sons. And so I responded to him and said, you know, I have 3 daughters, and I hope that you teach your sons so that when my daughters go out with your sons, that they're going to be safe. That's a responsibility that we have. This came up through discussion here, and so I said I would tell this little incident. Okay, and as a matter of fact, we're stepping exactly into something like that. This is maybe not the most familiar story in the Bible, in the Old Testament, but we know that David had quite a number of wives, so he had sons and daughters who were half-siblings. And there's this story that you find in 2 Samuel from chapters 13 to 18. It's a long, involved story. Obviously, we can't go through it piece by piece. I'm going to relate it and pick out the things that I'm trying to use. So this Amnon was one of David's sons, and he had a half-sister, Tamar, a beautiful young woman, and he was in love with her. And his cousin, David's brother's son, asked him, what's the matter with you? Why are you so down in the mouth? And so he told him. And so the cousin gave him some advice. Well, you know, pretend you're sick and to get your father to send Tamar to come and do some baking for you, and then have your fun with her. And that's what happened. And so he ended up raping her. And then her brother finds out, because she comes out wailing and having torn her cloak and stuff like that. And of course, her brother, the half-brother to the guy who did it, was very angry, but he told her, just be quiet. He was already hatching a plan. And so he had sheep. I mean, these were adult men. This guy had sheep, and his plan was he would invite the whole family, David and all his siblings and half-siblings and so on and so forth. And then when he had them all together, then Amnon would be taken care of. David didn't fall for it, though. He said, no, there's no point in us all going. You go and shear your sheep and good enough. Well, he at least wanted to have permission to invite his brothers. And so finally David gave in and let him invite the brothers. And once they were up there, then he told his hired hands, okay, you kill Amnon, and don't worry, I'm going to make sure nothing's going to happen to you. And that's what happened. And of course, news got back to David pretty quickly that Absalom has killed all his brothers, all your sons. And of course, David was distraught. And then Jonadab, exactly the guy who told Amnon how to trick his half-sister and David and so on and so forth, he says, no, just Amnon will be dead. And sure enough, it turned out that it had only been Amnon. And so Absalom was able to achieve what he had set out to achieve. Of course, Absalom wasn't very welcome in Jerusalem then. So he ran away to his grandfathers. We're talking grown men here. Ran away to his grandfathers and stayed there. But this situation was festering in the family. And David's military leader, Joab, he could see what was going on. And there's a whole story. I won't tell it too detailed, but he tells a woman to go and pretend a situation for David that her two sons fought or had a disagreement, and one of them struck the other one and killed him, and now the family wants to have her other son, but that is her only livelihood. As a widow, it was the children that took care of her, and so she was in this corner here, and David then, of course, says that, well, leave it with me, I'm going to take care of it, that your son, nothing happens, your remaining son, nothing happens to him. And then, of course, in the end, she says, well, what about your situation? And then, of course, David clicked right away, and he says, did Joab have something to do with this? Did he put you up for this? This whole story was actually made up, that she had fed King David there. But Joab was trying to get things back in order, patched up in David's family. And then, while it gets more complicated yet, Absalom is allowed to come back to Jerusalem, but David won't have anything to do with him. And so finally, Joab has to step in again and try to get them to reconcile. And so they do, but it's not really a reconciliation. I mean, they went through the motions, and so Absalom starts to undermine David, make friends with the population, and it comes the time where David has to flee the city, and Absalom comes and rules in Jerusalem. And then Absalom calls Israelites together from out of the nation and goes to war. See, the army basically had gone with David, and so a war started, and in that war, I think it's actually Joab himself who kills Absalom. And then David starts to howl and grieve, and Joab tells him, hey, you better smarten up, because now the people are confused. They protected you, and now you're lamenting that your enemy is dead. So that is a very quick look at this situation. But Job had to correct David, and fortunately David responded. Now we want to take some applications out of this. When a child misbehaves, the first thing that we need to do is take a moment to assess the situation. Try to figure out, why did the child behave as it did? There could be various reasons. Maybe whatever his misbehavior was an accident, or maybe it was an impulse. Sometimes one does something just on an impulse, and it wasn't a calculated thing, it wasn't a malicious thing, and so on. Or maybe copycat. Maybe somebody else did it, and hey, I'll try it too. Or it can have been a calculated thing. Could even have been the result of a previous bad parental decision, that we did something and this is a response. So we need to just take a moment to sort of run a little bit of a checklist. Why would the child have behaved that way? Also, what's actually the damage? Is it something that's easily corrected? Or is it more serious? It's going to, maybe it affects relationships, maybe it affects neighbors, stuff like that. We had to deal with something like that. Our boy and a neighbor's boy went to a third neighbor and threw tomatoes against the stucco wall. Well, that takes some work, and that's exactly what happened. The boy that was with our son, his mother said, "Whatever you make your son do, that's what you make my son do." And so they got pails of water and scrub brush, and then they had to scrub tomato off the that was actually a widow lady off her wall. Is this something that will affect life only very briefly, or is this something that's going to be longer lasting? Local or far-reaching? Just sort of assess the damage. Sometimes something has happened and actually quite little damage is done, but it catches us at the wrong time and we over-respond, overreact. So it's always good to do a little bit of assessment. Did the child know that what he was doing was wrong? Or maybe it was a temptation. Maybe he jolly well knew that it was wrong, but temptation was just too big. Or does he have a nasty streak? Did he do this because that streak kicked in and he was going to do it? Well, maybe he was provoked. Maybe a sibling or something like that provoked him and he reacted. Or did it stem out of actual rebellion? That he was, no, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. Now, also, how is the child responding? Is it ashamed of what it did? Is it disappointed? Is it crying? Or is he bewildered and not sure what exactly he has, what ball he has got rolling here? And or maybe he's afraid, maybe even terrified, or indifferent, or maybe he is challenging you. You had asked him to do something, and there's no way that he's going to shovel the manure out of the barn. Somebody else can do that. So just looking at the situation, what is going on. And I'm not talking here about sitting down and grabbling for hours and stuff like that, but just taking some of these things into consideration a little bit. And what emotion is welling up in us as parents? Did it set off anger or frustration or laughter? Or maybe glee. Now I can, he has needed the punishment for a while already. Now this gives me an opportunity to set something straight. Or maybe horror. Maybe it's something that you did as a kid, and you have in the meantime seen how stupid it was, and the last thing you want is your child to do what you are ashamed of. Those are all reactions that can happen in us. Then there are things like, is my day full and busy and I don't have time to deal with this? Or is it a day where I do have time to deal with it? Those, again, are factors that can influence how we respond and whether we end up responding wisely or not so wisely. We can be under extreme pressure, or is this something that's going to cost money? I remember being probably about 18 years old, and it was a Sunday afternoon. I had Dad's pickup truck, and I and a friend were in Jerintol, Manitoba, and it was snowing lightly. It was a little bit slippery, and when we came around the corner, I hit a parked car. Now the truck is going to have to go to the body shop, and it's going to cost money, and so on and so forth. And flawed and best. Now my dad didn't make a big thing out of it, and it got fixed, and I'm assuming he paid it. He never asked me to pay it, so there was mercy there. There was understanding there. But things happen. Or maybe you have company and your kid is acting up. That's a tough one. Or you're in a meeting or talking on the phone or something like that, and you're embarrassed down to your toes at what this person is witnessing there in your family and from your child. Okay, what actually happened? Was it a cup of milk that got spilled? Or maybe it was another child complaining about your child. That your child, harmed him somehow, or took something that was his, or who knows what. Or maybe another child is bleeding because of your child. Or what will the neighbors think? These are all things that influence us, how we respond. Has this happened before? Is this something minor with no real damage? Or is it something that needs to be nipped in the bud? Nipped in the bud. I and two other missionary men organized a youth camp, a teenager camp in the Yukon. And so this was roughing it. I mean, it was not the kind of camps that we go to in southern Canada or that I'm sure you go to here. This was tents and out in the bush and water from the river and those kinds of things. The teenagers that came, they were pretty well all Native children, First Nations children, and it went up to age 16. And we had divided the responsibilities among us. And so I was the director of the camp, and two boys, a 15-year-old and a 14-year-old, all of a sudden came from the back. I didn't notice anything. And all of a sudden, one grabbed this arm and one grabbed this arm. And they were going to throw me down and, teach, direct or something. Fortunately, I noticed it in time, and the only thought that went through my mind is, John, stay on your feet. And so that's what I did. I stayed on my feet. They were not able to get me down. But then the girls came to us. Exactly, these two boys had been touching them on their breasts and stuff like that. Well, that needed to be nipped in the bud. We were not quite united. Two of us said, these guys are going home, and this was the first day of camp. One of them wanted to show some mercy, but he backed down, and we didn't tell those boys the next morning at 5 o'clock in the morning. I was in their tent, pack up into my van, and I was on the road 8 hours to take them home and go back to camp. And we did not have any such troubles anymore in that camp. Sometimes it's something that needs to be taken care of right then and there, and consequently without any questions. Sometimes maybe it's something that should have been dealt with a long time ago. I don't have a concrete example here, but that maybe it is time to rethink this whole thing and establish some rules around what happened. So this, we can see there are so many factors involved. Parenting isn't very straightforward or just a series of check marks that one can go through, because we as parents are so different. Our children are different, and all that plays roles. Some of you have been mentioning that you have taken temperament tests and stuff like that. I had included it in here. I didn't know whether you had here or not, but that's another thing. This goes way back. The Egyptians and the Greeks were already talking about some people behave one way and other people behave other ways. And so they basically said there are the introverts and extroverts, and there are those who talk and express their emotions, and those who don't. And so that is how the temperaments were thought of 2,000 plus years ago. And here, as a matter of fact, this is almost 400 years before Jesus walked the earth. They already were talking these kinds of things. Look at this. The choleric temperament, they associated that with yellow bile, the bile that comes from the liver. And melancholic temperament, they associated that with black bile from the kidneys. The sanguine temperament, they associated that with blood from the heart. And the phlegmatic temperament with white phlegm from the lungs. So they associated these temperaments with various liquids in the body. Now, we know that those particular liquids actually have nothing to do with what personality we have or what temperament we have, but that's how all this started off. And these are very, very basic, and these 4 categories have been criticized as too simplistic. Some say there are 8 categories, others 16, and so on and so forth. But these 4 actually make it fairly easy to test. It doesn't get quite as involved. Can you imagine thinking about 16 different temperaments and trying to locate yourself? Even this temperament business, it's not neat and tidy. Because if you go by the 4 temperament system, nobody is just one particular temperament. You're always a mix of these. I'll show you an example in a little bit. But there are then series of questions that get asked, and that's how it's sorted out. where one fits. But usually there are two fairly strong ones. One is dominant even of those two, and the other one less so. Here actually are some of the strengths and weaknesses that are associated with these, and these are in your book. It'll probably be easiest to read them right out of your book. So that's something that you can, if it interests you, that you can look at. Now, some temperaments find parenting easier than other temperaments. And some temperaments are easier parented than others. But anyhow, the responsibility still lies with us. We brought our children into the world, and we are responsible to parent them. These temperaments and knowing something about them, they simply help us to understand the dynamics between a parent and a child, which will hopefully help to parent. I had a mother and a sister who were very alike. And because they both had a fairly strong temperament, it sometimes sparked a bit. As a matter of fact, that sister had a daughter where there were also sparks flying. So, temperaments do affect the relationship that we have with a child. That's why one child we may find quite a bit easier parenting because maybe there's one is a more sensitive, more gentle temperament than the other, and they can sort of make things work. Or if both are gentle, then probably is quite a warm relationship. And if both are cholerics, then maybe it's a little bit wilder. So if you're curious, there is a short little test. It's free of charge and stuff. I took it just out of curiosity. I checked it a little bit. I don't think it's any scam or anything like this. I tried to check that out. And if I remember correctly, there were 25 questions to answer. And there you have what they think John Hiebert is. So,
white phlegm.
Pardon me?
White phlegm. That's all I see.
Yep. And a little bit of yellow bile, yeah? But so, and it's not something that you build or you stake your life on. It's just something to help one understand a little bit. And then with this chart here, you can sort of check out, is it really true? Are these some of my weaknesses? Are these some of my strengths? One can check that out. So now, how does this affect us? I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit, because I'm sure that some of you are quite people-friendly. You're the sanguine type. And it's quite possible you would rather parent through friendship than through consequences. And making rules and sticking to them maybe doesn't come that easily. And changing behavior through distraction looks pretty good. I'll distract the kid and we'll sail over this. And I want you to understand this is not a right and wrong or a good and bad. You are who you are, and you have to deal with it. And your child is who he is, and you have to deal with it. And so we have to adjust ourselves and try to make this work. A choleric likes to establish rules and expects them to be obeyed. And he believes that misdeeds deserve consequences. Now, deciding whether the child needs compassion or consequences, that comes a bit hard for a cleric. Because a cleric is convinced that consequences do the job. So my wife has once in a while had to remind me a little bit to maybe gentle off a little bit. Phlegmatic. Phlegmatic likes order, so establishing rules isn't a problem. Enforcing rules, that is pretty tiring, even unpleasant. Deciding whether the child broke the rule deliberately or because of some personal quirk or environmental something that happened, that's hard. And so you like to wait. Let's dwell on this a little bit. And possibly in the end, nothing happens. You dwell and dwell and dwell and forget about it. And the melancholic. Melancholic is a little bit of a self-doubter. So you're not really sure that you can be the kind of parent that you should be. Even, are your rules really fair? Are they appropriate? So you're prone to give the benefit of the doubt, accept the excuse, let's keep peace. So those are some things to look out for. None of this is written in stone, but those can be tendencies that one should possibly pay attention to. Definitely if one starts to realize that my parenting isn't really going quite the way I would like it to. So pay some attention to that. There may be some answers lying right there. Parenting methods and procedures have to constantly be adjusted. I think a good word here would be fine-tuned. You know, we're sort of on the right path, but then we need to make little adjustments here and there and so on and so forth. Fine-tuned to the age of the child, because the child isn't static. It gets older, it grows, and so on and so forth, to the bent of the child, or the gifting, or the temperament, those kinds of things. So we're quite frequently fine-tuning our parenting. Consistency, and we've mentioned that here a number of times already. Enforcing rules one day and ignoring them the next only leads to confusion and trouble. A child no longer knows how to behave. I used to work for one of the deacons in our church for one winter. We were working on construction, and he had a few of his children were in high school at the time. And his children were pretty bright. And he told me one of his children had said that we have Mr. McMillan, he's strict in class. And we get along fine with him. And we have Mr. McKnight, and he's not strict at all. And we get along fine with him. But then, and I forget the name of the third teacher, and that's probably good, but he's all over the place. He's here one day and there the other day and so on. We never know where we're at. That's hard. So there's something to be said for consistency. Unity. Parenting requires unity of purpose and basic principles between mom and dad. Otherwise, your kid is going to divide and conquer. you'll sabotage the parenting chore. Clarity, making sure that I and my kid, that we and our children understand each other. What the rule is, why it's there, and so on and so forth. Clarity is important. There can be some pitfalls. When a child asks for permission for something and you weren't expecting it, and you're not even quite sure how you want to answer it, one thing not to do is to say no. And then as you think about it, well, actually, it wouldn't really matter. And change the tune and say, yeah, you can go. I've changed my mind. What you do if you do that is the child says, aha, I can make deals with this guy. No isn't necessarily no. And Dobson here argues that rather say, give me some time, I'll give you an answer yet. And then when you give an answer, you stick to it so that there's clarity. Sensitivity. Give yourself a few seconds to think of, why did this happen? Why did my child do this or behave this way and so on? Recognize his emotional state and so on and so forth. A hurting child needs some leniency, needs some care. A child who looks you in the eye and says, what are you going to do about it? That's a whole different thing. There, you need to have some backbone. Here are some quotes. Parenthood, it's about guiding the next generation and forgiving the last. So we guide our children and we forgive our parents. Because our parents will have made mistakes in parenting. We will too. We'll need forgiveness too yet down the road. So guide the child and forgive the parent, the previous generation. C.S. Lewis has said, children are not a distraction from more important work. They are the most important work. And then this one I threw in because it tickled my funny bone. Having a child is like getting a tattoo on your face. You better be committed. Okay, I'm going to pray this prayer. You can pray it along with me, or you can read along, however you wish. But with this, I want to commit ourselves as parents or as future parents to being the best parents we can be, and to asking the Lord to guide us and help us in this. Heavenly Father, we acknowledge that our children are in your image, designed and gifted by you, and therefore precious. We also admit that both they and we are sinners and in need of your help. Now, Father, as parents, give us patience, powers of observation and understanding, self-control, creativity in dealing with our child, and the wisdom to know what will be to our child's benefit. We praise you that as our Father, you love and gladly help us. Amen. I've really enjoyed these 4 evenings together. Hopefully some of it will be helpful to you someplace or other. And I would just leave you with this final. Oh, what's going on? Why is we? Can you hear it?